Art in the Age of Romanticism, 1789 to 1848. Most of Europe is in war by 1792. We have Robespierre's Reign of Terror in 1793, over 17,000 people killed. Later we have the Napoleonic Wars. We also have a move from the country to the city, and so we have these people that are migrating. And we're going to see how this is going to affect people, their lives, and how it affects art as well. Here's our map showing us where we're going to be talking about. So you can see that we're going to be introducing a lot into North America. So let's start off in Spain with Francisco Goya. This is The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters from Los Caprichos, 1799. This is one of 80 etchings and aquatints he did for this. So Goya, if you remember, was appointed royal painter in 1786. Charles IV appointed him first painter to the king. Velázquez had previously held that post. So this book was actually published at his own expense and for a loss. He lost money on this. So we have the artist here asleep on the block of reason. And we have a lot of symbolism here. We have the owls representing folly and the bats representing ignorance. And what this is this is showing what the world is like without the Enlightenment logic. This is Goya's family of Charles IV. Now, if this starts to look a little familiar to you with the idea of the family, and then we have the artist back here painting, well, that's because of Velázquez. Goya very much admired Velázquez and wanted to kind of mimic him. So we've got, just like Velázquez's maids of honor, we've got the family. They're waiting to have their portrait done. We've got the artist in the background. He was painting this portrait. Now what he's trying to do is he's trying to make this a very informal portrait, because we don't have everyone looking at the artist or at the camera, if you will. We have some people looking away. In fact, this lady right here is looking completely away. We've got some people kind of looking at the camera, some people kind of looking off to the side. So this is meant to be just kind of a normal kind of snapshot, if you will. Queen Maria Luisa is actually in the same pose as Velázquez's infant in his painting Maids of Honor. 3rd of May, 1808. This is one in a series he did about the French occupation of Spain in 1808. So Charles IV is forced to abdicate the throne. His son, Ferdinand VII, then inherits the throne, but he is deposed by Napoleon's troops. Napoleon's brother, Joseph Bonaparte, becomes the new ruler. Ferdinand becomes reinstated as kind of a puppet government. And we have this actual event that happens. There is a mass execution of Spanish rebels on May 3rd, 1808, on a hill outside of Madrid. And Goya paints this with a lot of emotion and realism that we have here. So first off, you'll notice that Napoleon's troops, we don't see their faces. They are nameless, faceless beings pointing guns. That's all you see. But of the rebels, you see their faces. You see their faces as they're lying on the ground. You see this friar here. You see that he's a friar because he's got the tonsured hair. And then we have this man who is illuminated. He's in white and yellow. which are the colors of the papacy. He also has his hands up in the sign of the cross. And in his right hand, if you look very, very, very closely, there is a stigmata. And the stigmata is the wound, the wounds on Christ where the nails went in. If that should appear on someone else, it is referred to as a stigmata. So we have some very definite religious imagery here. You also definitely see which side of the war that Goya is on. And now we have Saturn devouring one of his children. Now, that's what this has been referred to for years and years. Recently, it has been retitled Untitled because it was discovered that the title was just something that someone had randomly put on it. It doesn't actually have anything to do with Goya's thoughts about the piece. So, Goya, he started out in Velasquez's footsteps. He's painter to the king. This is a high status position. We have this war and the atrocities that he sees. And basically, he has a mental breakdown. This is one of a series called The Black Paintings that he painted directly on the wall of a farmhouse just outside of Madrid. He was suffering from depression at the time, dealing with all that he had seen, all that had happened to him. And so we have this kind of horrific image. And again, the title, Saturn devouring one of his children, which has, of course, mythological overtones, has nothing really to do with this piece. This really has to do with pain and suffering and the mental anguish that Goya was actually enduring. Now we move to Britain and William Blake. So William Blake began as an engraver with the Royal Academy in 1779, but he decided to leave after only 1 year because he said it was too repressive. So he was pretty much self-taught as an artist. He was also a poet, so you might be remembering some of his poetry. I believe you might still read some of him in Western Civ. He actually really liked history painting, but he rejected oil painting in general because he associated it with the hierarchy and the elitism of the academy. So we see a lot of more these color prints that Blake does. This is one of 12 large color prints that he did in 1795. This is the early history of the world. Supposedly when man was morally good, free, and had imagination. So this one, Elohim creating Adam, or God creating Adam, this is based on Genesis 2:7. And the Lord God formed man out of the dust of the ground. And so we see that happening. We see God with his angelic wings, and he is forming man, or Adam, here out of the ground, out of what's there. Here's another one of Blake's pieces. This is the Lazar House, or the House of Death. This is based on Milton's Paradise Lost, where the angel Michael makes Adam look into the future and confront the consequences of his sin. So we had the beginning, the creation of Adam, and this is Adam looking at what has happened. So we have Adam here confronting all of this, and this is God in the heavens, kind of overseeing everything. John Constable, The Haywain, or Landscape Noon. Now, Constable's landscape paintings are very realistic views. He actually worked at the Royal Academy in 1799, but he left to study nature. He felt like the Academy was, again, stifling. He's quoted to have said, "Painting is but another word for feeling." To give you an idea of scale, this is 6 feet wide, so this is not a small landscape. So we see lots of little details here. We've got a dog, we have the The wagon, the people, and the horses. Another little boat over here and a little person over here. We actually have lots of little details when you start looking at this piece. He really thought of landscape painters as being a very scientific thing. He again wanted to get out in nature and look at everything and study it. He also wanted to try to elevate landscape to be a higher status. Again, we very much have a hierarchy of painting at this time. This is Salisbury Cathedral from the Meadows. Again, we have the details, the small people. The nature is definitely the overwhelming part. But again, we have a cute little dog. We've got the horses. We've got the guy here. We've got another guy on a boat. Guy over here. We've got the church in the background. So this one, the rainbow, represents hope after death. He actually attached to the back of this piece The Seasons, the poem The Seasons by James Thompson. And that he exhibited this poem with the painting whenever he exhibited it at the Academy in 1831. He actually painted with a palette knife, and so when you look at Constable's works up close, there's very bold, agitated brushwork. There's there's some thickness to it. And you notice that there's a lot of contrast between the light and the dark. Salisbury Cathedral is there in the background. And to emphasize the motive of the idea of death, this is a tomb here. Joseph Mallard William Turner. Joseph Turner's fine. This is Snowstorm, Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps. He also was an associate of the Royal Academy in 1799. He was 24 at the time. He really wanted to outdo the masters. He wanted to be the biggest, the best. And he really did these landscapes on this epic scale. He was also very much into the idea of sublime. Remember, we're still in Romanticism here. So the idea of nature becoming overwhelming, awe-inspiring, both in a good and a bad way. So it's awe-inspiring and it's also horrific, as we're going to see. So he realizes that the masters, or what is considered to be the top, is history paintings. And so he oftentimes kind of combines the two. So right now, we've got this painting that's combining this magnificent landscape, this awe-inspiring landscape, with history. So we have the Carthaginian general Hannibal leading his troops across the French Alps in 218 BC to launch a surprise attack on the Romans during the Punic Wars. Now, we see that Hannibal's troops are plundering villages. We can see that because we've got some fire and some chaos happening down here. But we also have this snowstorm that's appearing, and it's kind of coming on like a wave. It's like this wave of death and destruction is coming down on these troops. You can actually see, I know it's extremely hard, but you can actually see a couple of elephants. Again, about Hannibal crossing the Alps on elephants. But we again have the idea that man is insignificant compared to the massive, overwhelming, awe-inspiring force of nature. Again, we have another real event. This is Turner's The Slave Ship, or Slavers throwing overboard the dead and dying, typhoon coming on. Now you see that Turner's style is very atmospheric. We don't have as much detail as we have had with some of the other landscape painters. This is very much kind of a guttural, emotional feeling in his works. Now again, this is a real event that happened in 1781. So while it was in the past, it had been in the recent past. So there was a newspaper account of the ship, the Zong, and it had run into the storm that was out on the sea. And the ship's captain threw over all of the slaves that were on board. It was a slave ship, so it was filled with slaves. And he did this to collect insurance, because if the cargo, which is what these men and women were considered, was lost at sea, then he would be paid for it. But if they had died from illness, he wouldn't. There were 400 slaves aboard this ship. 132 died in this incident. So this was a horrific account, and I think that's what he's trying to illustrate, is kind of the horror of it. So we don't have lots of details. It's very atmospheric. We have the reds and the golds of the sunset, but we have the waves, and they're cresting, and we can see the power of the waves. We have the darkness. We have this ship, but it's in the background. What we have in the foreground are people's arms, legs, body parts sticking up. We still see some of them still shackled. And then we have the fish and the birds and everything else coming to eat off of the dead carcasses. He's really wanting to showcase the horror of the event that had happened. Now we move to Germany, but equally depressing. This is Caspar David Friedrich. Friedrich is well known for his metaphorical pieces. Typically, his pieces have the human as the very insignificant, small scale as opposed to the nature. This is Monk by the Sea. This is one of a pair. In this one, the monk is contemplating death, contemplating throwing himself over the side of the cliff. The other one has the funeral for the monk. There's the monk here. Tiny comparison to nature, but we don't have lots of details. Again, it's a very atmospheric piece. We've got the rocky cliff, the choppy sea, and the darkness on the horizon. This is Abbey in an Oak Forest. Also very dark and depressing. Now, at this time, Germany is not a unified state like we see Germany today. It is a confederation of 300 German-speaking states. Because of this, when Napoleon and his troops attacked in the 1800s, they were not prepared. They were not ready to fight. And so there was a lot of death and destruction. I think he really illustrates that. So we've got the ruins of an abbey. All we see left is this one wall with the outline of a stained glass window. If we look very closely, we can see these monks. These are Capuchin monks. And if we look very closely, they're actually holding a coffin. And we realize that this is a cemetery that they are going to bury one of their own in. Again, we have the idea of the sublime. We have these trees in the middle of winter. So the idea that these are bleak and without the life, without the leaves. We have the bleakness of the landscape, the snow-covered harsh as the sun is setting on this. And the idea is the sun is setting on maybe even the way of life here. So again, a very depressing motif. All right, so let's go over to America and get a little happier now that we're nice and depressed. And so we're going to talk very briefly about the Hudson River School. The Hudson River School, not an actual school as in a school building, but a school of thought, a school of painting. And so these are artists that are traveling over the New York and New England area, and they are kind of discovering the awe-inspiring, in this case, the more positive ideas of awe-inspiring nature that America has to offer. So this the Hudson River School starts around the 1820s, By the way, we actually do have several academies happening in America at this time. We have the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts starting in 1802, in Boston, 1807, New York, 1825. So we have all of these art academies starting up. And then we've got this kind of school of thought, the Hudson River School, looking at the more positive, awe-inspiring views of nature, like we have on this Thomas Cole piece. Here's one from Frederick Edwin Church. All right, so we have now moved into neoclassical romanticism. I know, it seems like an oxymoron, but it's not quite. So let's talk about this. All right, so this is Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. This is a portrait of Napoleon on his imperial throne, 1806. So David, remember we had talked about him earlier, he is still very much influencing France. He had over 400 students in his lifetime, so obviously they were influenced. And remember, he had abolished the French Academy, but he had also been Napoleon's official court painter, and so we have his influence for quite a long time. Now, this portrait of Napoleon that Ingres does, Napoleon actually disliked it. He thought it was way too much, too glitzy, too imperial. He did not like it. Too much opulence for it. But that's what we have. We have Napoleon shown as a king, a rightful king, with all of the kingly stuff. So what do we have? We have the golden scepter of Charlemagne. We've got the golden scepter of Charlemagne is here. We also have over here the ivory hand of justice French medieval kings utilized. We also have the idea of almost a halo. You notice that the throne kind of creates this golden halo around Napoleon. Of course, Napoleon has on the accoutrements of kingship here with the ermine cloak, red velvet, very much all of the trappings. Here is Ingres' Grand Odalisque. So something that's becoming very popular during this time is called Orientalism. And so this is anything that is exotic, tends to be from the Middle East, hence the term Orientalism, the quote Orient, but anything kind of different, exotic. And so we have this woman, and she is got everything from a peacock feather fan that she has in her hand, to a hookah over here, to beautifully embroidered silk. We have silk and jewels in her hair, and that she's laying on some fur, it looks like. So she's literally surrounded by this opulence. So this was commissioned by Caroline Murat, Napoleon's sister and queen of Naples. So Napoleon and his troops went into Egypt in 1798, and so we have this huge spike of interest in everything Egyptian, and again, this really goes into that idea of Orientalism. You'll notice that she herself is not exotic or Oriental or Persian or any of these other areas. She is very European. She's just surrounded by all the trapping. You'll also notice that body-wise, there's some issues. Let's look. So we have this arm right here. We seem to have some issues mainly around the elbow area, maybe the length of the arm even. And we definitely have some issues with that curve in her back. We seem to have several extra vertebrae the way it's being portrayed. So not quite exact realism here. So Ingres actually becomes very popular around this time, Part of this has to do with Napoleon. He falls from grace in 1815, and that means David, who is painter to the emperor since 1801, he is now exiled, and so Ingres, who is very different, becomes very popular. So we see the rise of his popularity. Here's another Ingres painting. This one, she's got her clothes on. Again, we have the interest in Orientalism with the fan back here and the piece of pottery. And of course, he does a little bit with the mirror. We see the mirror, and we have her being mirrored right here. Madame Inné Mortessier was the wife of a wealthy banker. This was a commission. It took him actually 12 years to finish this. Quite a long time. He started in 1844, finished in 1856. Ingres actually gets what's due. He is actually elected as director of the French Academy in 1825. Antoine Jean Gros, Napoleon in the Pest House at Jaffa. Alright, so this is going to be an example of propaganda. Gros was a student of David's. Again, David was a court painter to Napoleon. So Jaffa, we're talking Palestine, or now Israel, in case you're wondering where we're talking. This was a very successful piece exhibited at the Salon. This is 23 feet wide, so it's a very large piece. And this is very much promoting Napoleon as this kind of hero. So we have the idea that Napoleon and his troops are coming through. And what happens, and this actually did happen, the bubonic plague broke out amongst the French troops. And so we have the idea here that Napoleon is walking amongst all these sick, dead, and dying that you can see here. Some seem to have already passed away. Some seem to be almost. But he is walking through them just fine. We see his commander back here is covering his mouth and nose because of the smell. But no, Napoleon's fine. And look, he's even touching one of these men. So this is very much a propaganda piece. This is not how it played out. Now again, the plague hitting the troops and all of this did happen, but Napoleon being so magnificent, not so much. So what really happened was he actually shut them into a area and ended up poisoning them as he left Jaffa. So there was no coming through and being the kind of saintly healer that we see here. So again, another very interesting propaganda piece. You also notice that there's a lot of allusions to kind of his Christ-like ability to walk amongst the sick, maybe even heal the sick. Again, lots of propaganda here. Theodore Géricault. He was independently wealthy. He was self-taught. So he has some interesting cases. So this one, the charging chasseur, we have some interesting angles and things. He's trying to kind of see how he can paint this horse at this angle with the man twisting back. So we have a lot of interesting things going on here. Géricault did not live very long. His dates are 1791 to 1824. He died of tuberculosis at a young age. This is the one you're probably most familiar with of his. This is the Raft of the Medusa. This is his third and last painting to exhibit at the Salon, and really has again that theme of man versus nature. So again, this is an actual event. So July 2nd, 1816. So he's painting this in 1818. So this is very recent history. The French frigate, the Medusa, had sailed for Senegal under Captain Comte de Chaumeret. a nobleman who had returned after Napoleon's downfall. Well, he was a nobleman. He had no sense actually piloting this ship. And he ended up running the ship aground in shallow water off the coast of Mauritania, which is on the West African coast. 400 people were on board. There were 6 lifeboats that he filled with government officials and officers. And 153 passengers ended up on this makeshift raft that was only 20 by 7 meters wide. Only 15 of these people survived. The raft had been adrift for 12 days. And this is the moment when the survivors first see a ship in the background, in the distance. Now, there was a lot of death, a lot of sickness, and there was also cannibalism. This was a very shocking story when it hit the news. And we see kind of all of this happening. So we see these dead. We see a few that have still alive, but just, I think, shocked that they are and that what might be happening. We see the very tiny speck of a ship here in the background. And we kind of see the horror of this as we have these dead bodies that are being caught here with all of this makeshift raft. There is a blood-stained axe that references the cannibalism that happened. So Géricault actually interviewed survivors of this for this piece. He also studied the faces of the dead and dying in morgues and hospitals. He ended up dying, again, not long after this, at the age of 32. And this is portrait of an insane man. So he also went into these insane asylums, places where people with various mental illnesses were kept in horrible conditions at that point. But he would paint these portraits to try to see if there was commonality of what was going on with these people. Eugene Delacroix. This is Scenes from the Massacre at Chios. So we have, again, another painting filled with misery and suffering. Again, based on unfortunate reality. So in 1820, again, only a few short years before this was painted, we have the Greeks revolted against the Ottoman Empire. So in return, the Turks raided the island of Chios. They destroyed the villages and killed or enslaved almost all of the population of the island of 20,000 people. So this is what we have here, is we have people who have been killed. This mother is obviously dead. Her babe is still alive, trying to grasp on to the mother. We have the elderly. We have some that we're not sure if they're still alive or not. And we have the idea that this Turk is taking these women as slaves. We have the burning of villages, and we have the rounding up and killing of people. So again, kind of the horror of reality here. Delacroix was from Paris. He was very wealthy, and he was self-taught. This is the death of Sardanapalus. This is based on Byron's 1821 unrhymed poem, Sardanapalus, which was talking about the last Assyrian king overthrown by the rebels because of his licentiousness and apathy. He ends up committing suicide at the very end. So Delacroix kind of invented this scene, but again, it's based on this poem, which is based on real events. So we have Sardanapalus here on his bed, surrounded by his, obviously, concubines, surrounded by his wealth, surrounded by all this, and we have this chaos that's kind of whipping up around him as people are being killed, and we've got animals and everything coming into this view. It's chaotic. And so the idea is that this kind of maybe is even a funeral pyre for him, that everything is surrounding. And this is one, Women of Algiers. You notice that the palette's actually a little different. Delacroix painted this after a trip to North Africa. And his palette changed very much brighter and looser. He says that the lighting was so much different in North Africa, and it opened up his eye. So this is a harem, inside of a harem. He had to get special permission to enter and paint this, but he did. So we have all this exotic architecture, clothing, and then the colors. Jean-Baptiste Camille Corot, View of Rome, the bridge and Castle Sant'Angelo with the cupola of St. Peter's. So Corot was well known for plein air or open air paintings. So these are rapid color studies in oil, in nature. This is an oil on paper, and he created this in an hour. Amazing. He considered plein air paintings to be the truth of the moment. So Castel Sant'Angelo, that is this round building here. Obviously, this is the cupola of St. Peter's. And obviously, this is the bridge. So, Castel Sant'Angelo was a mausoleum built by Hadrian. It was then used by popes as a fortress, residence, and then a prison. Currently, it is a museum. So it has been quite a bit of different things. There's another Corot piece. This one is very almost fantastical. It's kind of got this whimsical feel to it. Corot became very popular and successful. He liked to paint from nature, but he also liked to create these pieces that had these very romantic kind of moods. And it's kind of almost like a hazy memory. So we have this very thin, transparent brush strokes that are layered on, kind of floating, kind of magical, ethereal light. Another one of his pieces like that. Pierre-Etienne Theodore Rousseau, Under the Birches, Evening. So Rousseau started in the Barbizon school in the 1830s. This Barbizon was a village on the border of the forest of Fontainebleau, and this is where various artists would settle. This was a former royal hunting preserve, so it was very untouched. And all these various artists started kind of flocking to this area. Really tried to capture the essence of nature here. Francois Rude, The Departure of the Volunteers, 1792. So he was enrolled in the École des Beaux-Arts in 1809. He was very much a Napoleon sympathizer. So when Napoleon was defeated in 1815, he fled to Brussels, ended up returning to Paris in 1822. So in 1833, Rude receives one of 4 sculptural commissions for the Arc de Triomphe. The Arc had been left unfinished when Napoleon left, and this new government wanted to finish this kind of as a show of the unity of France and of French people and to try to heal these old wounds. So this is honoring volunteers who rallied to defend the new French Republic from the Austro-Prussian threat in 1792. The winged figure here represents France and liberty. And then we've got these French soldiers. But you notice that they all look different. And that's because these are representing soldiers from different periods of France's past. And so we have the idea of the unity of all these different people of these eras. We're unifying under the symbolic French figure up here. So the idea is, again, becoming one and unifying. And again, this is very important during this time. The Houses of Parliament in London, Sir Charles Barry and A.W.N. Welby Pugin. Commissioned in 1836, the previous building had burned down. Seems to happen a lot. And so there was a competition. So kind of a call to artists and architects to redesign the new Houses of Parliament. So part of this competition required that they use the Gothic or Elizabethan style. So out of the 97 entries, 91 were Gothic. Again, it's the English national style here. So Barry, he's the head architect. So he's very much interested in the building being very symmetrical, and you notice that a lot with this. Pugin, he is actually Britain's leading expert on the Gothic. So he's working on the interiors and details for the exterior. And that's where we're actually going to end our look at Romanticism. So hopefully on a little higher note, a little happier note than what it was for the most part today.